Well, welcome to the Shawnee Library and part 2 of Beggars Day. Feel free to click on a green chair and have a seat and make yourself to home. Derry's here. As a hot buttered strumpet she is. Barland, have you been to the library before? I think you look new to me. That doesn't mean that you haven't been here before. We've been here in Second Life for 4 years. And we bring stories of all kinds to life in Second Life through live voice readings just like tonight's. Most of what we do is literature, but we cover a wide range of genres. We have a bunch of different people who present. And we also sometimes have other things like traditional telling and poetry. And I know it's hard to remember that poetry is literature, but, well, in fact it is, I guess. And that's what we do here in Second Life. We promote stories. And have been doing so for quite some time. But that's not the only thing we do here. We also like to recognize people in the corporeal world doing good work. So this month, we're not quite doing that. Well, we kind of are. These readings are freely given. They don't cost you anything. You're welcome to come and sit and listen. But if you decide that you would like to show some Linden love for the efforts put forth, you're more than welcome to. There's a yellow and black bee-striped jar over by the wall. That is our tip jar. And we don't actually take those tips ourselves. We turn them around and we give them to nonprofits. And the nonprofit that we're raising for, that we are inviting people, thank you, Herndon, to join us in supporting last month and this month, is our home here, the Community Virtual Library. The Community Virtual Library brings library resources to residents in the virtual world, and also acts as a great way for real-life professional librarians to network and connect and find ways to better serve their patrons, as well as explore virtuality as a way to serve their patrons in the air-breathing world. So that's what the Community Virtual Library is all about. They opened their arms and gave us a home, and so we're putting a little bit of time in for them. Let's see what else. This book is in copyright, so and the playwright and the writers in the room, the authors in the room. So I need to ask you not to record this unless you have previous permission, which we actually are recording it with previous permission by MJ, and it will be available on our YouTube channel probably in a day or so. So if you miss part of it or something gets distracting, you can catch up. Let's see what else. We have a standard group. So we can join you up, Derry or I think Gyro or Shandon. Shandon is our host tonight. Oh, we lost Barlin, so I really don't have to do any more of this anymore. Oh, there we go. We can just go straight to the story. Well, before we start the story, yes, you can. Oh, good. Thanks, Gyro. Taylor, sorry. You may wonder about the chicken in the Henry VIII costume, in the royal costume. Not the morning after I did last week's reading, I got I got the June Smithsonian in the mail, and it was too funny actually, because that's the cover of the Smithsonian for June, and it's an article that the article has really little to do with Beggars Day, except it's called about how chicken conquered the world. The entire issue is about food. So anyway, there's an article about wine, there's an article about oysters, there's all sorts of great articles. But I thought it was just too funny. And so I brought a panel, and if you click on the royal chicken over there, it will open a URL link in your viewer. Yeah, well, it starts out kind of like that. Chicken crossed the road back in Roman times. It will take you to that article on the Smithsonian Magazine website. I just thought it was too funny to have the royal chicken out. So there's other chicken art on the. There's other chicken art in the article, but I can't say that it's like this one. This one, looks like a classic portrait. The other are actual plucked chickens, like out of the the meat section in the store dressed up as historical figures. Yeah, when I opened up, when I went, oh, really? And opened it up, I went, oh, yeah, really, okay. But let's go ahead and start with the story. And here we go. If you need any assistance, go ahead, and Shandon is our host tonight. And we'll start in with the story. Where we left off, which was Elfane was about to read from the history of Galaway. Oh, and this is not. Hang on. Let me change something here really quick. Not what I meant to put on. There we go. All right. So, Elfane was about to read, and by the command of the king, and here is what he read. It was in the 23rd year of the reign of good King Clare that his eldest son, good Prince Monaghan, went questing. His idea was to discover the source of the lost artifact. From the last dispatch received from him, we know that he was on the trail. Unfortunately, that was the last we ever heard of him. Good Prince Monaghan, all soldiers, retainers, and the shield of many uses were lost. It was assumed that all of the party died, although it was never confirmed. The official list of those missing are Prince Monaghan, Sid Whitley Winston, Lorenzo Ponzio. Elfane read on through another 26 names. Percy sat still. The possibilities of the king's command were boundless. Larry made a servant to a mere slip of a girl, and then sending them out with an old woman in search of... Oh, anything could happen in the wild. Larry could be killed in an accident, or better yet, the whole party could be lost, like the first one. And then, what would the king do for an heir? That lovely phrase, by marriage or blood, came to Percy like a lamb nuzzling its mother. But what if the brat managed to pull it off? He'd already been cheated once when the king refused to die of grief when Percy's puny kid sister kicked the bucket. Percy stopped his thoughts. He realized that he had to get control. He was getting emotional. He calmed himself with his private chant. King Percy, King Percy, King Percy. Then, with sudden certainty, he knew what he'd have to do. He would have to somehow make sure Larry didn't come back from the quest, or at the very least that he would fail to in his day of service. The boy looked very upset. Okay, shaking my head. There we go. The boy looked very upset. Percy could see that some of the king's lessons were already beginning to set in. He would have to contrive to go with them. No, if he went with them, he'd lose the element of surprise should he arrange for an accident. He'd have to find some way to follow after they were a few days on the trail. That way, if he caught up with them in the wild country and found the whole party in a smashed-up heap at the bottom of a cliff or torn asunder by wolves, why, what could anyone have done to stop it? A disaster like that and a few gentle reminders that it was Willy's fault would definitely send Willy around the bend. Then again, thought Percy, if he could contrive to follow them without the king's knowledge, arrange a disaster, and return only to announce that he wanted to join them, he could discover the broken bodies and report it to the king with no shade of guilt falling on him. Percy's mind whirled with possibilities until he refocused on the events in the hall. Elfane was just finishing the list, and Stan Carter. None were found, and searching proved fruitless. All anyone knows for sure was that they entered the forest of Beggar as far as the Grey Goose Hills. Here Elfane looked up from the book and asked the king. There's a related material included in the last dispatch of Prince Monaghan. Shall I read it all, sire? Willy gave a start when he realized Elfane was speaking to him. He'd been thinking of his older brother Monaghan, a robust scholar who would rather chase a mystery to its end than rule the entire world. Monaghan had told him more than once that he wished Willy could be king, leaving him free to explore and study. Willy sighed. His brother had gotten part of his wish anyway. Monaghan was another light in his life that had gone out much too soon. "Shall I read the rest, sire?" Elfane repeated, unsure of what to do. No, thank you, Elfane. John? Yes, my lord? Do you know of any person in the kingdom more knowledgeable of the country's history than your son, Elfane? No, sire, I do not. John didn't even try and hide his pride in the young man. Then I charge you, Elfane, son of John, with this quest also. You will be the second only to Brishee who will lead. Is this agreeable to you? Elfane's head swam. Agreeable? Is it agreeable? To get out of the castle, into the air, to stop being a servant and to be his own man? To follow Prince Monaghan, the story of whom he'd read every day since he'd discovered it? Was it agreeable? Elfane could only nod his assent. The king was in the middle of saying, "Well, I think this makes up our jolly little party. We can get on with other business," only he didn't get to finish his statement because Cruith, up to her tricks again, goosed the unsuspecting Dugan so that he interrupted the king with a loud, "But Jesus, I'm going to—" Unfortunately for him, that was where he caught himself. The king looked at him in confusion, and then his face cleared. "Oh, you're absolutely right, Dugan. I was going to send a guard, but since you're so adamant about going too, well, we'll miss you around the castle. You've been a good soldier. You should get what you want now and then. You are charged with guarding those on the quest. Now, if you'll all report to the castle keep to be outfitted, I see no reason why you shouldn't leave today. Next?" Later, John slipped away from the Beggar's Day goings-on and looked for his son. He found Elfane in his room, digging through notebooks and stuffing odd pages in a traveling bag. Elfane looked up at him and grinned. "Thanks, Dad." "Thanks for what?" "Don't tell me you weren't behind Willy sending me on this quest." "All right, I won't tell you, but I wasn't. This is something Willy came up with all by himself. I was as surprised as you were. I didn't think he knew I was interested in history." Elfane suddenly stopped packing and sat back on his heels. "Damn! What's wrong?" "Oh, now I get it. How could I have been so stupid? The king is only sending me to keep Larry out of trouble. Once again, it's Elfane the babysitter." "Is that what the king said to you?" "That may not be what he said, but that's what he meant." "I think not. Willy really wants to find out what happened to his brother Monaghan. The artifact in the shield, and when he said Larry was to serve Brishee, he meant it, as he did when he made you historian and second in command. For now, at least, you are no longer a servant, and if you expect to succeed, you'd best stop thinking like one." Elfane looked at his father. To his knowledge, John had never thought like a servant. He did his work well, and he held his head high every day of his life. "I'll make you a deal, Dad. I bring home the artifact, the shield, and find out what happened to Monaghan, and you retire and let me take care of you for a while?" "I'll agree to the retirement if Willy will approve, but you can't take care of me, lad. I'm done taking care of until I'm done taking care of myself. I've discovered a few wild oats left in this old hide." "Done, you old dog. One trick, Elfane, that you could learn from an old dog. Old dogs never forget their way home. Make sure you come back, son." Elfane finished packing and stood face to face with his father. "You've got my word." "Good as gold to me." John grabbed Elfane in a big hug that said more than paltry words, even golden words. "Best be getting back to the hall. Willy will be almost done with lunch by now." "What would he do without you?" "I think more to the point, what will we do without him? For hundreds of years this country has had strong, good leaders, kings and queens, with spirits and hearts and souls. If you could but teach that to Larry on his quest, you'll have saved the country." "Teach Larry? That pompous ass? He'll be lucky if somebody doesn't kick his butt up between his shoulders." "Well," John grinned, "whatever it takes." And so father and son parted with laughter. Hang on 2 seconds here. Brishee was not laughing. Mostly she was trying to slow down her heart and get her mind under control. She was standing in the royal library, ostensibly looking at maps. To look at her, you might have thought she was absorbed in the maps. Her mind, however, was far from focused. "What is happening to me?" she silently screamed to herself. "This is not happening." But yes, it is. I'm going on a quest for the king, and his son is my personal servant. I have no clue what to do. This is the craziest thing ever to happen to anybody. All right. Let's take stock here. What do I know? I know Cruith is somehow more in on this whole deal than she's telling me. She's crazy, but she's smart. That history fellow, he seems to know his stuff. He's awful pale, though. And the prince, well, it's bad enough I have to go out looking for stuff that was lost 25 years ago. I have to take that sausage along for the ride? Huh? The ride? Oh, if wishes were horses, then beggars would ride. Well, I guess wishes are horses, because as of now, I ride. I just wish I could understand these flaming maps. They're very easy to understand. What? Brishee was unaware that she was speaking out loud. Elfane came up beside her and turned to the map on the table right side up. "I can show you. Look, here is where we are now." Brishee was weary, and she had an instant mistrust of any man who got physically close to her. Elfane had walked right up beside her. She watched his every move, but he seemed totally involved with the maps and explaining them to her. Maybe this clerk wouldn't be so bad after all. Then again, he'd probably start crying for his mother the first night the wolves howled at the edge of camp. Brishee was genuinely puzzled as to whether she was having good or bad luck. Larry was certain as to the nature of his luck. It was most definitely bad. He was convinced no other human being had ever, in all of time, had luck as bad as he. Life, in his opinion, could not be more unfair. He wished he could talk to Percy. Percy always made him feel better, always made his thoughts less ragged around the edges. Percy found ways to help him with his troubles. Now he was in big trouble, and Percy was nowhere to be seen. What was going on? Was this some kind of elaborate hoax his father was acting out to straighten Larry up? Is the king just going to scare the living royalty out of me and then relent? Larry wondered. His mind was spinning with possibilities. He walked compulsively around the small chamber just off the king's hall. He had been held there after the rest of the questing party went to get supplies. Obviously, the king wanted words with him. Larry decided that it must be his pardon that the king was going to deliver. He relaxed. He let his anxious breath flow out of his lungs. He was actually smiling when King Willy opened the door and let himself in. "You're looking very cheerful," commented the king, noticing his son's countenance. "Well, Dad, perhaps I'm just thankful for the scales to be at last removed from my eyes. All this time I've been living as an ungrateful lout, never realizing how special being a prince is. And hey, I've learned so much from this whole experience. I can't tell you how humble. And Larry, your words are as good as the pies served on the floor of a cattle barn. I didn't come here to listen to you lie. I have 3 items of advice, and it's all the favor that you'll get from me for a year and a day. First, please, son, try. Work hard, accomplish something. It's a feeling you should experience. Second, get to know the people and learn to respect them for who they are. The most important people on earth are within our borders. Without them, we have no kingdom, and without a kingdom, what is a king? Last, try to be brave, to make me proud, but most important, come back alive. I love you, son, and I'd rather see you live in banishment than not see you live at all. Well, he rubbed his nose as if it itched and was gone through the door in the next instant. Larry shook his head. What a joker, he said as he wondered what would happen to him next. Dugan poked his head in. Get down to the stables and start loading supplies. Larry attempted to freeze Dugan with a contemptuous stare. Piss off! Dugan's eyes didn't waver from Larry's as he slowly crossed the room. Dugan made use of his considerable midriff to butt Larry up against the wall. Larry had never been belly-butted before, and it quite took the wind out of him. Even God wouldn't have crossed Dugan on this, the blackest of all his days. He just settled with his betters in the betting pool. He had lost everything he'd made in the past year on his pools, and was back to square one with a paltry soldier's salary. It was later rumored that Dugan actually kicked a chicken that afternoon, but it was never substantiated. For a man in such a mood, choking a servant to death would have been no more to him than cracking a louse between his thumbnails, and to Dugan, a man of orders are orders, Larry was just that, a louse, until he had completed his year and a day of service. When he said, "You'll be getting down to the stables now," it left no doubt in either mind as to what Larry would be doing next. Dugan clattered down the stairs of the keep to the castle. Cruith was already there, standing beside a mound of material. She was instructing a steady stream of bondsmen as they labored, backs bent, to add to the pile. Dugan took it all in and roared, "Stop! Or get this pile of crap back into the stores!" Cruith wheeled on him. "Dugan, it is my job to get supplies. Don't get in my way." "Well, how the hell are we supposed to carry all that, eh?" smugly Cruith said. "Why, with a wagon, of course." "There'll be no wagon." "Why not?" "Because 6 days from here we run out of roads, and there'll be no way to take the wagon across the wild." "We can't take all this glorious stuff. I have to tell you, Dugan, having a free hand in the king's stores is so much more fun than raiding his chicken coop." "I don't understand why you torment that man so. What has he ever done to you?" It's more than what he hasn't done." "And what's that?" "None of your business is what that is. We can't take any of this. We've got to strip down, travel light, live off the land." "Well, what about that keg of winter ale? We can't take that?" Dugan licked his lips. "Right. We'll commandeer a small wagon and keep it as far as the forest of Beggar." One of the brighter bondsmen, who realized they'd have to carry at least some of the goods back to the store, asked, "Which of the foodstuffs will you be taking?" Cruith replied at once, "The pickled chicken, of course. Definitely the chicken." Later, Percy found Larry trying to harness a horse to the wagon. The horse, whose name was Ross, stood patiently letting Larry fumble with the tack. Deep in the recesses of Ross's equine mind, he knew the longer it took to harness him, the longer he could stand in this nice barn and eat oats. Once every few minutes he would slap Larry across the face with his tail, just because he could. Ross figured, in a battle of wits, that he had Larry outgunned. Then Percy showed up and spoiled the whole thing. Percy ordered the snickering stable boy, who had been watching Larry's fumbling, to harness the horse to the wagon. Ross was being teamed with a no-name, no-personality wagon and pack horse. Just my luck, thought Russ, a gelding. Why don't I ever get teamed with a mare? Percy took Larry aside. "I cannot believe the extent of your father's cruelties, my prince." "Percy, is there nothing you can do to get me out of this?" "The king won't even see me. No doubt he knows I'll plead for you." This was all a bald-faced lie. Percy hadn't even tried to see the king. He didn't want any of that wrath to rub off on him. But there was no way for Larry to know that. "You've got to get through this the best you can. When you're king, you can end this barbaric custom by royal decree." "Oh, my noble prince," lamented Percy, if only I could take your place. I'd gladly be a slave to the lowliest wretch for the rest of my life if I could spare you but one day of this humiliation." Larry bought it and was touched. "Thank you, Percy. It's good to know I have one friend left." Percy was suddenly inspired, but he let his voice drop into a low, conspiratorial tone. "I bring you warning, sire. None of your party is to be trusted. I think the king has a plot to make sure that you fail the test of kings. He did say that he'd rather see me live in banishment." Larry could easily believe almost any evil in others. It was so close to the surface in himself. "Aha!" Percy was being deliberately vague. "When you're finishing in unknown waters, it's good to put out as many lines as possible. That would explain the message sent by the king to Elfame. I think it's a plot. Watch out for Elfane in particular, but trust none of them. Pretend you've accepted your fate and that you're trying to make the best of it, but watch yourself, Prince. Upon hearing himself called Prince one last time, Larry clenched his jaw and drew himself up. I'll make it, Uncle Percy, and don't worry, they won't get rid of me that easy. I know who my true friends are. Aye. As sure as the sun goes round the earth. And with that, Percy walked away. He was unaware of the astronomical irony of his last statement. As he walked across the keep, the breeze caught his forelock, and for an instant the red T flashed in the sun. Seeing the brand, Cruith grunted to herself, I should have known, and went back to work sampling all the food she'd selected. When Percy arrived at the door of the North Tower, he frowned and cursed. His stoop was covered in chicken shit. Their first day on the road was uneventful. The biggest hitch was that Larry didn't know how to drive a team. Elfane was patient. Larry, resentful, and Ross, feeling put upon, was as irritable as possible. Eventually, with only one minor accident, they went more or less straight down the road. Brishee and Elfane were in front, riding close, referring to the maps and notes Elfane continually pulled from his saddlebags. Larry remained wagon-bound, not daring to let his attention drift for a second because Ross would inevitably choose that instant to bolt. Cruith and Dugan brought up the rear, or more exactly brought up the side, since neither one wanted to be too far away from the food. Their first night in camp, Brishee and Elfane conferred late by the fire, discussing the known route of Monaghan and where he could have gone after the record ended. It's very odd, and in fact it's the central mystery surrounding Monaghan's disappearance. The last reported location was exactly where his trail ended, and when the king's men went back to search for him... Here Elfane caught his breath and stared intently at the map spread out on his knees. While he looked to be pondering the mystery of Monaghan, he was actually fighting to control his mind. Oh, the way Brishee looked in the firelight. But that's not what I'm here for, he reminded himself. This is the most important thing I'll ever do in my life. I can't be distracted. Elfane cleared his throat and tapped the map with his fingers. It was here. Right here on the border of what they call the Grey Goose Hills. Brishee's trust in Elfane was by this time complete. She had filed him as harmless but very informative. With no time to plan, and never having led an expedition before, Brishee found herself questing by the seat of her pants. She knew that she must have some kind of plan before they arrived at the Grey Goose Hills. For the purpose of planning, Elfane was her only help among the party. They found nothing? No trace of Monaghan's party? Footprints within the camp, none without. Except for the messenger who delivered the last report, there was no trace of anyone leaving the camp in any direction. That sounds like a caravanner's tale. I've heard many in my days as a slave. Elfane flinched at the word slave. He really couldn't bear to think of her enslaved. Brishee thought the page boy was getting cold. She threw him another log on the fire and she said, "Those old stories always end like that." Brishee took on a completely different voice. She sounded like one of the traveling storytellers that roamed the caravan routes. And that's all there is to it. They were never seen again. Not a thread of their clothes, not a hair from their heads. Still, some lonely travelers have said that they've heard their moans of suffering and cries of pain when they passed the crossroads at midnight on a full moon during the winter solstice. And then, without warning, she let out a long, lonesome wolf howl that chilled places no fire could ever warm. Ow! Dugan came crashing back from using the bushes, his short sword unsheathed. "Wolves! Wolves, build up the fire! Issue weapons!" And then he turned around to face the shadows beyond the light from the fire and offered a challenge. "You'll have to take me first, you mangy hounds of hell!" Brishee snuck up quietly behind Dugan and howled again. "Ow! Ow!" She almost got her head cut off for that prank. Dugan pulled his blow just in time to miss her. He left his sword stuck in the dirt and turned slowly to Brishee. With all respect, ma'am, I suggest you consider the reflexes of a fighting man before you pull such stunts again. I am charged with protecting this party. I can't do it if you play tricks on me. Why, thank you very much. Well, it wasn't meant to be a trick. Well, the first time I howled, it wasn't. That was part of the story. Have you ever heard the story of the little boy who cried wolf? Asked Dugan, feeling vastly superior. You're entirely right. I'm sorry, Dugan. Sorry about almost hacking your head off, but a man's got to do what a man's got to do. Cruith appeared at the edge of the bushes, exactly where Dugan had entered. A man's got to do? What were you doing out there in the bushes, Dugan? Well, I don't think I have reason to answer that. But don't you think, continued Cruith, don't you think it would be a good idea to check for wolves before you drop your pants and start singing old folk songs off-key? Dugan was offended. What? I was not off-key. Brishee held up her hands. All right. It doesn't matter who did what. We are going into the wild, and we need to know where each other are in case something happens. Brishee had never led a quest before, but she'd caravanned all her life. From now on, if you leave sight of others, tell someone where you'll be. I don't think we have need for a watch tonight, but after today, when we camp, we'll watch in 3-hour shifts. When we travel, Dugan will ride point. Any questions? Dugan wasn't happy about being separated from the wagon, but he felt a flood of respect for Brishee. She was showing some common sense. Dugan eyed her, and he decided that she had the jaw of a leader. It sounds fine to me, miss. I'd prefer if you called me Brishee. Certainly, miss, was Dugan's reply, although he was grinning. I have some questions. Brishee? Elfane jumped at the chance to use her name. What's the plan? What are we going to do when we get there? How are we going to find... Why do they call them the Grey Goose Hills? Brishee's instinct told her never to let her crew know that she didn't know what she was doing. She had cut Elfane off with the first question with the first question that came to mind. Oh, that's an idea. I wonder. Anyway. Elfane hurriedly shuffled his notes and then read from a tattered sheet. Here it is in Monaghan's own words. When we arrived at the edge of the Grey Goose Hills, I can only assume this place is named after a grey goose because it's the color of the roiling fog bank that confronts us. I can only assume that there are hills in that cloud of doom because it's absolutely obscured from our view of anything within it. That's all I can find about the hills, Brishee. Ha! Elfane thought to himself. I worked her name in again. Well, what about those who went in search of Monaghan's party? What do they say about the hills? Much the same. They tried to search within, but none that entered ever returned. Well, there's that old camp tale again. We'll search the fog, and we'll have to. Brishee knew that the answer lay somewhere behind the fog. But how will we survive? It's been tried. Being lost in an eternal fog did not sound productive to Elfane. An old goat-herder's trick. Brishee knew that now was not the time to be specific. Well, we certainly have enough old goats. Cruith cackled loudly and gave Dugan a vicious jab in the ribs. They all laughed, and the conversation took on a more chit-chat tone. Underneath the wagon, Larry snorted and rolled over. Insufferable clods, he thought. They don't need to plot against me. They'll kill me out of sheer stupidity. I've got to find a way out of this nightmare. One that doesn't prevent me from becoming king. Safe in his blankets, Larry had time to reflect on his troubles. Looking up at the floorboards of the wagon, far from the fire, Larry felt a loneliness he could not identify. The emptiness that he managed to stave off with wild affairs and even wilder escapades crept into him from the cold ground. Even though he openly despised his father, he missed him. Of course, Larry would never admit that, even to himself. What was going through was the little boy's feeling of abandonment that he had felt at the death of his mother. Loneliness turned to self-pity, and he rolled over onto his stomach and stared out under the front of the wagon. Again, it occurred to him that his father might relent. This fantasy grew in his mind until he imagined his father at that very moment pacing his bedroom, worried sick about his only son. Larry smiled to himself when he thought of his father's anguish. He was certain that with half an excuse the king would cancel this mad venture and send him to work in the royal spas, or perhaps excuse him altogether and let him get back to more pleasurable pursuits. If only something were to happen that would send them back. Something that would give the king the excuse he needed to end this wild trek. It was from then that Larry's eyes landed on the hitch pin. From his dreary lessons in wagon hitching, he had learned that the hitch pin was the key to keeping wagon and team together. It was a pin that fit between the tongue of the wagon and the wagon itself. It was a connector and a pivot and the weakest point of the design. Weak points are always draw jackals like Larry. Larry realized that if the hitch pin broke on the right kind of incline, the wagon would be lost. His weakness in logic and mechanics made him fail to realize that were the pin to break on an incline, the driver would be quite probably accompanying the wagon to its final resting place. Larry stopped thinking when he realized how to destroy the wagon. He took a quick look at the others gathered by the fire. Their talk had grown friendly now, and they shared a bucket of beer. Like a snake on his belly, Larry crawled forward to the hitch pin hanging from its ratty strand of hemp. It was a piece of summer oak, not that Larry would know that. It was hand-carved and hardened with fire, almost as hard as a rock, but not as brittle. A well-made hitch pin had to be in obviously bad shape to break. Yeah, exactly. But Larry didn't know that. So he took out his dagger and he began to carve a notch in one side of the pin. He looked once more to the gathering by the fire. Laugh it up, fools. Someday I will be king, he said, as he gouged at the wood. The party broke up around midnight, and they got a late start in the morning. Incredibly, Larry was the first up and had the team hitched before most were stirring. The hitch pin held all that day, and sundown found them at a crossroads complete with a country inn. Even before they piled up in the yard, they could smell the joint roasting on the fire. It didn't take much discussion to decide to spend the night there instead of camp. Larry made no complaints about his accommodations in the stables, and Cruith took a bath. Dinner was about an hour off. After Brishee had made sure that the horses and Larry were given adequate accommodations, she returned to the room she was to share with Cruith. The first thing that hit her was a pair of long woolen drawers, hung as they were on a line connected to the top of the door. They couldn't miss. Cruith was mostly submerged in a huge iron tub located in front of a blazing fire. The tub and Cruith were steaming. Cruith was leaning back over the top edge of the tub. She had her hands behind her head. She was stretching, her back arched, her breasts sailing against the firelight. In spite of herself, Brishee couldn't help but think that Cruith didn't look as old as she should have. "Oh, you're back, are you?" Cruith was genuinely disappointed. She sighed and settled back into the tub. "Well, I didn't mean to interrupt. It's just that, well, this is my room, too. I wanted to get ready for dinner. Wash up, you know." Cruith stood in the tub. She wrapped a large towel around herself as she stepped out. She walked near the fire, bent over, and began drying her hair in its heat. "I'm sorry," said Brishee. I didn't mean to barge in. It's just that I didn't have any other place to go. I'm really sorry if I... Here, I'll bring your supper up to you." "What? I'll be eating with you in the dining room. Thank you very much. Why do you think I went to all the trouble of taking a bath?" Seeing Cruith like this, Brishee couldn't help herself. You look so different, Cruith. I can't believe it. You're beautiful?" "Yes." Without the grime to underscore the lines in her face, Cruith had dropped 25 years. Without the voluminous folds of her many dresses and cloaks, her frame had straightened. As Brishee watched, Cruith reached into a bag, and with a quick movement she turned, pressing her hand to her mouth. When she turned back, Cruith smiled at her with perfect teeth. Brishee couldn't help but gasp at the transformation. Releasing the towel, standing naked in the firelight, Cruith said, "Read it and weep." And then she broke into the wild laughter that Brishee had first heard in the dungeon. I'm sorry, Cruith. I don't mean to be acting so shocked. It's just that you look so different. Cruith wrapped a towel around herself again and began checking to see if her clothes were dry. Well, you can't expect a gal to stay in her chicken-stealing outfit forever. She pulled a skirt and a blouse from her drying lines. Well, it's all dry except my woolies. Oh, well, I'll just have to go without. You won't tell, will you? No, of course not. I think it's time we had a bit of a talk. About what? For she seemed more interested in the tub than in talking. She was eyeing the still steaming water as if it had magical properties and wondering what kind of transformation it would work on her. Well, that water is basically clean. It was to be my soak, but I only just got in when you came back. Sorry, I interrupted. No harm. And why don't you just nip out of those rags and jump in? It'll do you a world of good, not to mention making you easier for the rest of us to be around. Brishee's eyes furrowed. Do I really smell that bad? Oh, no, you don't smell bad. Not to a goat. Brishee took off her clothes and slid into the tub. Cruith sat on a stool with a cake of raw soap and began to wash her hair for her. Brishee couldn't remember the last time she had bathed, but she did remember the feeling, and she liked it. Finally, when she was scrubbed pink and the water began to cool, she stepped out by the fire and let Cruith wrap her in a towel. Now, sit down, dearie-o, said Cruith, pushing forward the stool. I have something to ask you about this expedition. Cruith began brushing Brishee's hair out. You don't have a clue as to what you're doing, do you? What do you mean? This whole quest is a bit different than what you're used to doing, isn't it? After all, one day you were a goat herder, and the next you're out questing for the king. I say that's a bit of a line of usual job advancement. You would normally have to move up through sheep herder and cattle herder to prison warder before being made leader of an expedition. Brishee chuckled. So far, it hasn't been that much different from herding goats. I know you're used to moving things from one place to another, but soon this little escapade is going to get dangerous. Now, I trust your common sense. I think you've got a good head on your shoulders, and you're no fool. The forest of Ballygar, however, contains things you've never seen before, and few people have ever seen. Well, how do you know that? I've been there. Well, you see, I'm born of the people from beyond the Grey Goose Hills. I'm from the village of Mima. The statement hung over Brishee's head. She turned and took the brush from Cruith's hand. Standing up, she asked, Do you know your way around in the hills? Like the back end of a stable, boy. I don't understand. Too bad. Well, I know the Grey Goose Hills well. You see, when I was your age, I left Mima and I traveled through the hills. I was peeking out of the fog one day when I saw the men sent by King Clare to look for Prince Monaghan. Now, I've always had a bit of the will-o'-the-wisp in my nature. Most folks from Mima do, so I decided on the spot to follow them when they left. I did. I ended up in Galaway, working on a chicken farm with the then Prince Willy. Why did you steal his chickens? Brishee was suddenly curious. Sorry, dearie-o, but that's an entirely different story. The point is, I can help you get in the Grey Goose Hills. Brishee felt a wave of relief. She had been very worried about the hills. Her best idea so far was to tie all the horses to a long line so that no one would be lost in the fog as they traveled. She grabbed Cruith by the shoulders and half shouted, Cruith, you saved us all! Cruith grabbed Brishee by the shoulders and whispered in an ominous tone, Nothing can save you from the Grey Goose Hills. There are things in there that have no natural reason for being. No matter how much you know or how careful you are, if you stay in the hills long enough, something will get you. Oh, said Brishee, feeling as if the rug under her feet had suddenly disappeared. Cruith continued in the same frightening rasp. Now, Brishee, you must tell me two things. First, are you a virgin? Yes. Why? Well, because it's more important than you know. Now, second, are you hungry? Brishee felt as if there was now nothing beneath where the rug had been. Out of her confusion, she simply answered, Yes. What difference does that make? What difference? Why, it's dinner time, you babe in the woods. Cruith's sense of humor would take some time to grow on Brishee. Brishee picked up her soiled dress as Cruith laughed at her own joke. Well, I wish I had some clean clothes. Well, you can't wear that, Cruith said as she snatched the dress and threw it into the bathtub. You can't wear that. It's all wet. Brishee was just about to decide to throw Cruith into the tub when Cruith presented a stack of folded clothes. A little something from the royal stores, my lady. Brishee examined the clothes with satisfaction. Woolen howls, apparently, too. There was practical linen underwear, a thick cotton shirt, leather breeches, woolen stockings, and the thick-soled boots that laced up crisscross across her calves. Indeed, clothes for coping with the wild. Suddenly, she seized Cruith by the shoulders and completely mimicking the older woman's whisper, said, "Let's eat." They were almost giggling as Brishee finished dressing. On their way out, Cruith's long Janes, I guess, confronted them from the doorway. "Looks like your drawers are still dripping." Brishee liked to dide holding a straight face. "Want to borrow a pair of mine?" Cruith threw herself up royally and replied, "I wear my woolies or nothing at all. Let's go. I feel a draft." And with that, they proceeded to dinner in a very light mood. Dugan's stomach was in a very light mood as he and Elfane waited for the women to come down to dinner. Dugan was sure his gustatorial organ was very light, since it contained nothing but air and ale. He and Elfane had both done a quick get-the-dust-off wash-up before promptly reporting to the dining room for resupply. That had been an hour and a half ago. Since then, all they'd done was order ale and eye the staircase. Periodically, their stomachs growled their way into the conversation, whereas all chat would stop, and then they would turn to the staircase and salivate. "Well," said Dugan expansively, "ooh," as he dipped his tin mug again into the bucket of beer between the two men, "at least we've no more work today." His inflection was that of a man who had put in a good 12 hours, although he hadn't. "Our supplies are stored, the animals and the servants fed. If only we could eat." He poured more ale down his throat. This action produced a sound much like a bucketful of water hitting a mud puddle. "Larry's been fed?" Elfane had been Larry's servant for most of his days. His habit of a lifetime was hard to break. "I'm sure they feed the servants right after they slop the hogs." "But you don't think much of servants, do you?" If it wasn't actually a frost in Elfane's voice, there was certainly a chill. "Any reason I should?" "Really, Dugan, you know as well as I that until the day before yesterday I was Larry's servant." "But you're not now, are you? You had the sense and the guts to rise above." "Well, there are lots of reasons for staying a servant," said Elfane, his eyes gleaming as he thought of his father. "Easy, lad. I'm not trying to insult you." Elfane reached his mug into the bucket to fetch ale. The vessel scraped the bottom. "We're out of beer." He sounded sad. Here, bring us a bucket of beer," Dugan called in a voice that he used to break up riots. He clapped Elfane on the back so hard that Elfane could taste his last meal. "I've got to tell you something, my friend." Dugan was a bit glazed as he gazed at Elfane. He repeated, "My friend," and he squeezed the kid nearly to the point of extinction. "Oh, you've got to stop thinking about Larry. He's a servant and nothing more. If you treat him like anything else, it won't be a fair test of kings, and I myself will cry foul and prove the test invalid. It's right here, it's the right of a free man in Galaway, God bless her. As it is the servant's right to rise above his station. I did it, you did it, and if Larry's got the wherewithal, he can do it too." Dugan punctuated with a burp and looked to Elfane as if he should respond. Fortunately for all concerned at that moment, girlish laughter echoed down from the rooms above. Elfane and Dugan looked to the staircase, first with anticipation, and then with wonder, and then with disdain. Yeah, unfortunately, burping is not one of my talents. Ah, well, it's not them. It's some swag with his buxom wench, said Dugan, dismissing the couple, descending the dining room, and turning back to the bucket of beer that was just arriving. Elfane, however, was shaking his head and squinting intensely. No, Dugan, I think it's Brishee and Cruith. Well, what do you mean, boy? Can't you see that one of them is in pants and the other is... Elfane could have sworn that he heard the twang of Cupid's bow. He just wasn't sure who got the arrow, him or Dugan. Brishee in pants and a rider's shirt would break the heart of anyone, but it was obvious who Dugan had his eyes for, the mysteriously transformed Cruith. The woman's laughter subsided as they reached the table. I was going to use this evening's meal to go over my plans for this expedition, but I can see that you boys couldn't wait to get at the beer. Elfane wanted very much to hear Brishee's plans. He also was most anxious that she not think him besotted with the local brew. It's hard to say which twisted his tongue the most, the 2 buckets of beer or the sight of Brishee's behind in leather breeches. He stood up so fast that he knocked over his bench and he said, "No, Beery, we've just shared 1 bucket of Brishee. I want to..." It was the looks coming from the others that caused him to run down. That's not what I meant. I'm not so sure, said Cruith. I believe, Brishee, that these lads need some food, lest they hurt themselves with untold gallons of grog. You know, it's not safe to be around men who've had too much, and their wild, uninhibited lecherousness. They might fall asleep on you. Only Brishee actually laughed. Out in the stables, Larry worked his knife against the wood of the hitchpin. His notch was coming along nicely. They had seen some hills that lay on their path before they stopped for the night. Tomorrow would be the day the mission failed and they turned back for the castle. Larry carved as much as he dared. If the pin broke too soon, they would simply stop and get another. It had to break in the hills where they would lose the wagon. Again, his imaginings didn't reveal to him the fact that he would roll away with the wagon. And he wasn't the only person in the kingdom laying foul plots that very night. Percy was waiting by the back door of the North Tower. He straightened and listened intently as a knock sounded at the door. He hadn't heard the sound of footsteps approaching. The knock sounded a code. Percy opened the door a crack, keeping his hoe solidly against the bottom and his dagger firmly in his hand. "I've got blood on my hands," he said, issuing a challenge. "And I've got carrots in my ears." The password sequence was completed. Cousin Eugene Donegal had arrived. Actually, Percy had felt a little embarrassment by the password sequence. It was a piece of King Max's poetry. It was all that he could think of, and he'd been pressed for time when he arranged the meet. Percy had already resolved to track down and burn every copy of King Max's poetry as soon as he was king. He would see the flames set to every unintelligible page of that tripe, even if he had to scour the countryside to do it. And he would, too, because King Max's poetry was very popular. In particular, his rhyming series. It was a favorite with children and the tavern set. Often, the words were changed to words that, well, failed to convey the original motive and displayed a certain crassness popular in play yards and taverns. Percy could never take back poetry from the people, but he didn't know that. We're going to go a little bit past the hour. I'm coming up on a good stopping place, but I'm not there yet. Percy piled up the hood of his cloak. Pulled up the hood of his cloak and stepped into the narrow street. He fell in step with a man who was exactly the same height as he. Percy and his cousin walked quickly down the street. Only after their short hike and after they'd settled in a smoky, secluded room in the Feathered Pig did they speak. The man opposite Percy threw back his hood. It was as if a mirror were suddenly placed in front of Percy. Eugene was in every way the spitting image of Percy. Through some wild, dominant gene, both men had developed physically much the same. They even had much the same temperament. Eugene did, however, have a small scar that ran close to his hairline, the result of Percy settling an argument with him. From that incident, ever after, Eugene was always a bit submissive to Percy, and Percy slightly dominant. Not to mention, Eugene never brought up again the subject of Percy's mother and her mad night with the 5th Legion. "You've got a T on your forehead, cousin," Eugene spoke without thinking. Percy quickly pulled his hair over the mark. I know that. I was just pointing it out. Listen, I don't have much time. I need you to do me a favor. Whatever you need, cousin. Although I prefer that you didn't ask me to bring any more of those books from Italy. You say those color illustrations are art, but the border guards look at them entirely differently, and it was all I could do last night. That's not what I want, snapped Percy. I need you to be me for a while. I want to follow the prince, and I don't want it known that I'm gone. Why would you want to do that? Because I want to be king. You want to be king? Eugene asked loudly. Hold it down, you fool! But I found something in the laws that would allow me to become king if Larry fails his test, and there are no other heirs. I want to follow them and make sure that he fails. Well, that seems devious and mean. Eugene couldn't help but see Larry's side of the equation. But why should I want to help you? Eugene, you've never been one for thinking things through, have you? If I become king, you, being my nearest relative, would be royalty too. You would live in the palace with me. Think of it. Servants, jewels, fine clothes, wenches. Of course, if that's what you want. But you've got to help me. If I left the court, there would be suspicion. All you have to do is pretend to be me. Show up at dinner twice a week and let yourself be seen in the courtyard. I'm left alone for the most part. Just stay in the tower and no one will know that I'm gone. I hate that drafty old tower. Well, what am I doing up there all by myself for God knows how long? Eugene, if you're ever to get anything out of life, you must be prepared to make a few sacrifices. All I'm asking you to do is to live in the castle, eat good food, and pretend to be me for a while. Is it really so much? After all, I'm the one who's going to be out roughing in the wild. Don't you think you could do this one simple thing for me? Do I get a key to your wine cellar? Percy sighed. This was going to cost him. Yes. What about women? What about them? You know I'm not attached. Well, maybe you're not attached, but there is that maid that comes to visit you every Thursday and alternate Mondays. What about her? How did you know about her? You're my only living relative. It's only right that I should take an interest in your life. Eugene did his best to put on an innocent expression. No, I've told her not to come for a while. We can do nothing that will give us away. Oh, all right. I suppose I can do without for a while. Eugene had no intention of martyring his libido for Percy. He wasn't going to tell him that. There is something else I need you to do. What now? I need you to start a few rumors. Rumors? Of what sort? Rumors to the effect that Prince Larry isn't really serving that ex-slave as a servant, that the whole thing was for show, that instead of going in search of the shield and the artifact, they simply went somewhere into the mountains to wait out Larry's year and a day, that the other people on the quest were sent to serve him, that the slave girl was sent to be his concubine. Make it as vicious as possible. Now, why would I do that? Because, idiot, the more trouble we can stir up, the easier it will be for me to gain the throne. And once I take the throne, you become a duke. When do we make the switch? Tonight. The quicker we do it, the less anyone will have to suspect. Will you do it? What are relatives for if not to help their relations? Good. Once we're out of here, we'll switch cloaks and no one will be the wiser. Oh, and you'll have to wear my ring, too. And one more thing, Cousin Percy. Yes? Where do you keep those books from Italy? Looking out the window of the inn the next morning, Elphane could see that Larry had the wagon hitched up and waiting. It made him feel a little uncomfortable that Larry seemed to be doing his job well. Elphane certainly hadn't expected it. Turning away from the window, he announced to the rest of the party, "The wagon's ready." "Good," said Brishee, turning to address the others. "Now, according to Elphane, we should reach the Grey Goose Hills in 2 more days. From there, we'll see if we can find any clues that were overlooked and start exploring the fog." She and Cruith had decided to keep secret for now the fact that Cruith knew the hills. "Let's load up and get on with it." Their little party formed up with Dugan in the lead and headed into the hills away from the last vestiges of civilization. Larry was smiling as the horses strained against the first slope. Percy pulled up his exhausted, stumbling mount in the place where the questing party had camped in the woods. Traveling alone and without the burden of a wagon, he'd... Oh, wait. Did I mean to? Yes, I did mean to. I skipped a section. I'll explain why later. Traveling alone and without the burden of a wagon, he made very good time. This was as good a place to rest as any for a few hours. He unsaddled his horse and staked it where it could feed on grass. Although he was tired too and intended to rest for a while, he paced nervously about, his eyes on the ground. Between some wagon tracks, he found hardwood shavings. His brow furrowed for a moment in puzzlement, and the T on it crumpled. He shrugged and sat down under a tree and studied the pages from the history that he had taken and tried to find a place where he could ambush the questing party. Dugan realized he was getting too far ahead of the rest, and he stopped and turned his horse around to watch their progress up the steep slope. The wagon horses were sweating as they strained against the harness. "We'll be lucky if we don't have to ditch that wagon soon," and was his thought, just as he heard a loud snap. The horses, suddenly released from their burden, bolted ahead. The reins were torn from Larry's hands. A look of utter terror swept over his face as the wagon rolled backward, crashing through the bushes and out of sight over the lip of the hill. The rest of the party froze as the sounds of crashing and Larry's screams faded and suddenly stopped. It's not the fall, it's the stop at the bottom that'll get you. Dugan caught the team and led them quickly back to the others. The rest had dismounted and were standing at the edge of the embankment. "He's moving," said Elfane, obviously relieved. "It looks like he's not hurt." "Poor dumb luck that was. Why do you suppose he didn't jump?" asked Brishee. "Frozen with fear, I'd say. Either that or he didn't think through his plan." "Oh, yes." Dugan was holding up half of the severed hitchpin. "What? What are you saying?" Brishee strode quickly to Dugan and took the broken wood from him. "See for yourself. The hitchpin's been carved most of the way through. There was just enough left to pull the weight of the wagon on level ground. The strain of the hill broke it the rest of the way." "Why would anyone do that?" Brishee couldn't understand. "Well, it would seem to be a very clumsy and ill-considered attempt at sabotage from our former prince," Elfane answered. "Didn't the idiot realize he would go with the wagon?" "Larry has never been called what you might consider a logical thinker. He probably didn't get that far in his plotting." Cruith was still looking over the side. "Well, he's climbing back up. You can ask him." No, I think not," said Brishee as she flung the broken pin into the bushes. "I think we don't let on that we know what he did. But from now on, we watch the little bugger and see what he's up to." That's why he was up before the rest of us and had the wagon ready to go." Suddenly Elfane was laughing. Did you see the look on his face when he realized he was on a runaway wagon? Gods, what an idiot! When they had subdued their mirth, Larry regained the crest of the hill. They stood in the semicircle looking impatient as Larry struggled over the edge. "My gods, I was almost killed! Let's ride back to the inn. We can be back in the castle in a day or two, and we can tell my father how impossible this mission is. I'm sure he'll—" "Why did you come back empty-handed?" asked Brishee, cutting him off. "What?" Larry was without a clue. That wasn't the response he'd expected. "You've got to get those supplies up here so we can decide what to load on the pack horse." Larry looked down at the broken wagon and scattered supplies 200 yards below on the steep incline. "Bringing that stuff up here?" "Hop to it," said Brishee. We've lost enough time as it is." "I'm not going to carry all that up here. I've nearly been killed. You can't expect me to—" "You'll do it, and you'll do it quickly," Dugan interrupted him in a growl that left no room for debate. "Or you'll wish that you had died in your little tumble." Little tumble. "Look at those rocks." Here Larry turned to point out the hazards of the hill, and Dugan helped him up over the edge with a toe from his boot. When Larry had finally stopped rolling and sliding, Brishee called after him, "Bring up something for lunch first. No reason for the rest of us to starve while you're mucking about." It was early afternoon before Larry made his last straining trip up the incline. Brishee had him load the selected supplies on the pack horse. Dugan stood by, making sure they were lashed on properly. And then they resumed their trek, with Larry in the rear, riding Ross bareback and leading the pack horse. There was no mention of lunch for him. It seemed the rest were content to let him eat their dust. Just as they were getting under way again, Percy was reaching the inn. He would stay the night, letting himself and his horse rest. From the innkeeper he found out that the party had only left that morning. He had plenty of time to arrange his ambush.